I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, "No, no, 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 we're going to do this." And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
Let's get right into it. Thanks for joining us again, Tron.
Absolutely. It was 100% my pleasure.
What was so interesting about the last podcast we did, which was on certain aspects of Doritos that you had uncovered and then I hopefully added to, but it shows that how many life lessons can be learned from the obscure parts of our life that we just take for granted.
No, absolutely. I mean, it was like 37 years. I never thought about Doritos. And I'm like, oh my God. I look at it, I'm like, this is absolutely wild and a complete afterthought, like you said, right? Never thought about it, but the amount of effort that goes into it is astounding.
Right. It was lessons on food, lessons on investing, because why did Archie West decide that this was the product he was going to put his entire life behind? Lessons on the value of data, because they used data they spent $50 million on data in 1994 when they redesigned the Dorito, and on and on. There were so many lessons for business, for life, everything. So
I just want to say is with these consumer products, I've actually realized when you dig into anything that's like super, super popular, like McDonald's or Starbucks, there's various consumer facing things. Like I recently looked at like the top 50 market cap companies in the world. And I looked at the most consumer facing ones, McDonald's, Starbucks, obviously the big tech is super consumer facing. But when you start digging into those, that's where you kind of find these things that you've mentioned where you never really thought about it, but then you start teasing them out. You're like, this is crazy, right? And then obviously Doritos is part of Pepsi Cola, which is one of the largest CPG companies in the world.
yeah, and also it's interesting too. Like you mentioned McDonald's, and you've tweeted recently about Starbucks. Like people don't realize that companies aren't always what they seem. So like McDonald's seems like a food company, but in reality, as people now mostly know, it's a big real estate company where they then, lease their real estate to franchisees and so on. And Starbucks, as you point out, is actually a bank.
Or it could be, right? There's three of them actually in the annals of company X really does Y when you think it does Z. I think you named the first two, which is McDonald's is really a real estate company. Starbucks is kind of moonlighting as a bank. The other super popular one, which I'm sure you will know, is Harvard's really a hedge fund that just also happens to have a undergraduate and a graduate program, right? Same with Yale.
Well, and also like you could even go, it depends on how far you take the analogy, but like Google's really an advertising agency.
Yes.
And Facebook to some extent is largely a dating website. So I don't know.
No, exactly. And then Amazon suddenly just has this random $30 billion ad business on the side now.
Yeah, it's amazing how many. Like I was the other day just looking for obscure patents, and it's weird all the things that Google is patenting just left and right. Like their latest batch of patents, they're really getting into uh, AI powered security of smart homes. Like that's like seems to be a big
Right.
initiative for them. They've also patented anti gravity shoes for some reason, and they're doing a lot of work on using AI to determine where your eye is looking to pick a menu item. So you could pick a menu item without actually clicking on the menu item. So, and these are just all recent patents.
It sounds like round 2 of the Google glasses coming out, right? You remember when the glass holes were making the rounds like a decade ago?
Oh yeah, it was freaky. Like I remember one time I just like turned around at a restaurant and I saw someone looking at me and he was wearing the glasses and the light was on and he's like staring right at me. So you just wonder like what is going on there. But I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I love the Starbucks stuff, and you also talked about about Red Bull and how they were getting involved in Formula One racing. But there was a recent thread you wrote or a newsletter you wrote that I found fascinating, which was about how the Godfather almost didn't happen, and there were so many things in that I didn't know. And you don't have to have seen the Godfather to understand the importance of the things that we're going to talk about. Although I highly recommend the movie, but would you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. I would want to talk about that. I bought so many books because of the 50th anniversary of The Godfather's release. You know, whenever something gets re-released and then they just find a reason to remarket it, and then suckers like I'm that sucker that purchases those things.
I would too, by the way, because look, The Godfather really was one of the best movies in history. In fact, if someone hasn't seen The Godfather, and you're like, I don't want to watch it. It's an old movie, whatever. Just watch. There's a lot of clips on YouTube to demonstrate the acting of
Yes.
Al Pacino or Robert De Niro or Marlon Brando. Watch any of those, and it will make you want to watch the entire, at least Godfather 1 and Godfather 2.
Well, the thing with The Godfather is whether or not you've seen it, and honestly, at this point, I don't even want to do spoiler alerts anymore. Like I said it in my newsletter, I'm like, why am I doing a spoiler alert for a 50-year-old movie? Like that's not on me to be telling somebody to watch it, right? But it's just so culturally ingrained now, right? It's everywhere. Like what was Vito Corleone's? Make him offer they can't refuse. The horse's head. Everything that Sonny or Michael says through the flick, they show up everywhere.
Yeah, no, you're right. So actually, what are revenge is a dish that tastes best served cold. I even forgot that was in The Godfather. It's not personal; it's strictly business.
Exactly.
I forgot that was from The Godfather. And of course, the classic one, this was in Godfather 3. Like the only classic thing I think in Godfather 3 was just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in.
Pull me back in. Exactly.
I mean, that was repeated a billion times on The Sopranos because the guy was imitating Al Pacino in Godfather 3.
No, 100%. Well, so James, I know you're friends with Brian Koppelman, and the reason I bring this up is because I've heard him talk about Francis Ford Coppola's other classic, Apocalypse Now, a number of times. And the reason I bring that up is because I didn't realize that the making of The Godfather was almost as crazy as the making of Apocalypse Now, which is like epically famous. It was filmed shortly after the fall of Saigon in the Philippines under the Marcos regime. Crazy things happened there, but as I was reading about The Godfather, I'm like, whoa, this is like almost on par. So Coppola has just tortured himself to make these classics.
No, and not only that, that very year, 1972, when The Godfather was made, one of the movies that it was in the closest competition with at the Oscars was a movie called The Conversation, which was an unbelievably good movie, not as popular, but also directed by Francis Ford Coppola.
Oh, I just want to clarify. It was 74. It was Godfather 2 and Conversation. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, 74. So I mean, he was like nonstop making these incredibly good movies at a time when, as you point out, was very difficult for Hollywood. And so people kind of don't give him enough credit. I mean, they do give him a lot of credit, but he was an incredible director back then and now. But when he was getting his start, it was an unbelievable run he had.
Well, I did ask on Twitter if anybody could find a run from, as you mentioned, it was 1972 Godfather 1. 74 had The Conversation and Godfather 2, and then 79 was Apocalypse Now. So over 7 years, he created for sure 3 of the top 20 movies ever, and then The Conversation nominated for Best Picture, not a slouch, but incredible 7-year run. and in his 30s, just as unimaginable the creative output he went through then.
Yeah, and you have this. You took some lists from the greatest films ever according to IMDb, the American Film Institute, and the Hollywood Reporter. The Godfather, for Hollywood Reporter, The Godfather was number one. Then Wizard of Oz, Citizen Kane, Shawshank Redemption, Pulp Fiction. American Film Institute, The Godfather was number two. IMDb, Godfather was number two. Shawshank was number one in that one, and I guess
Yeah.
for the AFI, Citizen Kane was number one. I like that they had Casablanca, which I think is one of the best ever. But
Absolutely.
yeah, and Godfather 2 is also listed on two of these lists. So I mean, it's definitely had so much influence on future movies, future shows. I mean, you mentioned Koppelman, but not so much his show Billions, but the kind of competitor show that's on HBO, Succession, is very much
Right.
Godfather-like in terms of the relationships in the family. And
I actually never thought about that until I really dug into this piece. Because obviously, my instinct and growing up, my memory of The Godfather really was this crime epic, right? Obviously family based, but then it was literally Vito with his three sons, right? Is Sonny, Michael, and Fredo, and then Succession under HBO has the battle between the siblings. And what's funny is Tom Hagen, which is Robert Duvall in the Godfather series, who is not a blood child and gets moved aside by Michael in the second Godfather. Tom is also the name in Succession of the non-blood sibling type character.
oh yeah,
Shiv's husband.
I wonder if that's on purpose.
I wonder too. It's like, this can't be a coincidence. It's like, it's pretty close, right?
Well, and they do several times in Succession. They do call one of the less intelligent siblings Fredo all the time, even to his face. So
No,
like,
exactly.
like if someone's a Fredo, they're usually like the dumber older brother.
No, exactly, right? And well, that's the thing I added at the bottom when Shaquille O'Neal was going through his co-stars.
Yeah.
And he was comparing all of them to the Godfather characters.
I forgot. Did he say Kobe was Fredo? I forgot
He said Kobe was Sonny, so like would do anything to kind of win. Michael was the more understanding and like played the game well, and that was Dwayne Wade. So and then Penny Hardaway unfortunately was called Fredo. They never won a chip together. That's why.
Oh, that's funny. But I was surprised to learn that The Godfather almost didn't happen, and in part because I didn't know this. Hollywood was in decline then. I didn't know that. You said that movie revenues went down in 1969 and 1970. What was going on then? Was it the rise of TV?
It was the rise of TV was largely credited as, here comes the new medium that's going to sweep out the old one. So Hollywood had kind of knocked away vaudeville theater. So some of the most famous critics in the 60s of the film industry, or just observers, were like, what if film was just kind of this multi-decade thing that happened, but then was totally, subsequently taken over by television? I mean, we're kind of seeing it now with mobile, right? Like completely destroying the old cable business. So it's not the first time that we're seeing different mediums overtake a previous one, but that was part of it. And as the studio model kind of became less profitable, and the example that I brought up, which was, it came from one of these Godfather documentaries, was so fascinating, was in 1965, The Sound of Music comes out and it makes $290 million on a $8 million budget, right? It's like and also to this day, one of the most revered Hollywood epics ever. And then 3 years later, with the exact same director, star, cast, total flop. They did a movie with Julie Andrews called Star. It made $14 million on a $14 million budget, which really means they lost money because marketing is typically matched to the budget price, right? So
That's
that
fascinating.
was
Like, what happened?
It was just this was indicative from this Godfather documentary I watched of them saying this is basically the greatest example of how the industry was dying. People were losing interest. So 69 and 70 had the lowest foot traffic to theaters, basically from when Hollywood really started taking over in the 20s, 30s, and on.
I mean, it kind of is a good lesson in that people keep predicting the decline of Hollywood. So,
Right.
So here, the rise of TV maybe was going to be the decline of Hollywood. Then the rise of DVDs was going to be the decline, or CD-ROMs or whatever was going to be, and VCRs was going to be the decline. No one would have to go to a movie theater anymore because they could watch at home. And then the internet, everyone was going to watch on the internet. And then the pandemic, everyone was just going to watch on streaming services because nobody was allowed to go to a movie theater. And yet, still movies are putting out blockbusters that are bigger than ever every year.
Right. The Hollywood, the form of it keeps existing, keeps being culturally relevant, right? I think a lot of the criticism now is the things that do succeed are these sequels, comic book movie, like Marvel Cinematic Universe type content, which is true. And a lot of the creative talent has gone to television over the past decade or 2 decades. But Hollywood is still culturally relevant. Even after we saw what happened with the Oscars, we don't need to jump into the whole Will Smith, Chris Rock fiasco. But
my favorite topic, though. But yes,
it's just been talked about ad nauseum. I don't know if any of this any more to add, but I think the Hollywood's decline, we definitely are feeling it again. And there is a parallel with the 60s, 70s, though, right? As mentioned, these large conglomerates were buying up the studios and entertainment vessels, just like is happening now with big tech, right? Like Amazon just bought MGM. Disney acquired Fox. Technically, Disney's not big tech, but they're turning into a big tech play with their streaming service. So we're talking 50 years ago, a similar transition was happening. You had these massive conglomerates like Gulf and Western, which bought Paramount, owned 65 different companies, and they started off in the natural resources business.
Yeah, they were like an oil company, right?
Exactly.
I think they were J. Paul Getty's company.
Yeah, I think that was or at least he was involved with some of their businesses. And then Warner Brothers sold to Kinney, which was like primarily involved in funeral parlors and parking lots. So there's that parallel of the industry struggling and they got bought out by bigger money players.
Yeah, it's interesting because Hollywood by itself, a Hollywood production company by itself is a hit and miss business. Like you can't predict profits. So Wall Street will never give a pure play on a movie company a big valuation. But oddly, Kinney, which was like a parking lot, they owned parking lots. It was this guy, Steve Ross, started this parking lot company. Parking lots and car washes and funeral parlors.
Cash
That's
flow.
a steady business. Yeah, you can always predict what's going to happen this year, next year, and if he wants to grow, he just needs to buy more land to put parking lots and so on. So it became oddly a natural home to help stabilize these. So Kinney bought Warner Brothers, but Kinney ultimately grew to be Time Warner, which owned HBO, Time Magazine, People Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Warner Brothers, New Line Cinema, Atlantic Records, all the Warner labels. It became the biggest media company on the planet for a while, and now it's owned by I want to say Comcast or AT&T, one of them. I think AT&T.
Right. No, AT&T. Well, actually, no, they ended up spinning off some of the properties to combine with Discovery to make this whole new streaming thing, right? I think that's happening right now, actually.
Okay, it's so interesting. I used to love following all that, but you're right. So corporate influence was, Gulf and Western was taking over Paramount, a funeral parlor company was taking over Warner Brothers, and on and on and on. So there was the fear that these kind of talentless parking lot people would just produce bad movies. But by the way, I think it kind of underlines that executives in general, and you kind of describe this later about The Godfather, executives in general are there to kind of ruin the creative process. And it's only through the success of creatives like Francis Ford Coppola that we now know of these movies. If he had just listened to the executives, we never would have had The Godfather.
Right. He quotes a number of times how difficult it was, right? He said, and even the executives admit on the Paramount side, which they won an Oscar for this, right? They made the greatest movie ever. They also talked about how brutal the experience was. And I think it's to what you mentioned. It's like, this was not kind of their main avenue, right? Imagine you're just a corporate exec. You're running all these businesses, all the cash flow stuff you mentioned. You're given this asset where it's completely hit or miss. The industry's kind of dying and you're being tasked with creating the next blockbuster.
Yeah. And at that point, and it was weird too that, so you described the story well of Mario Puzo, who's the author of The Godfather. He had written 2 books before The Godfather, and they were kind of literary novels, meaning, I don't know, they were had deeper, more emotional concepts supposedly, and weren't larger than life stories. And so he couldn't make any money on these literary novels. He was a good writer. So he said, screw it, I'm going to make the most extravagant novel I could think of about these rumors I heard as a kid about the mafia. And in 1969, the year the book came out, it sold 9 million copies. I mean, I don't even know if novels today sell 9 million copies when they come out. Like,
James, you've written books. Like, what is a good number? I've heard like if you sell 10,000 books, it's like amazing in 2022, right?
you could make the New York Times bestseller list with as little as 2,000 copies sold.
Okay.
And
so 9 million is astounding.
Yeah, like 10,000, by the way, is a home run for most books.
Okay.
That's like probably 1% of books. And I have one book, Choose Yourself, which is sold over 1 million. And then I'm not even sure if the rest of my books combined have sold over 1 million.
Right.
So, and I've written over 20 books.
I've definitely read Choose Yourself, by the way. Just gonna throw that out there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I was in an airport the other day and I was going through TSA, and the TSA guy who was looking at my bag said, I read Choose Yourself. So
amazing.
So I know when you have like 1 million copies sold, a lot of people have read it or looked at it or whatever. So but for him to sell 9 million, like that's enormous. Like and that was in 1 year, 1969. So then I guess Robert Evans bought the rights to the book.
Well, I just want to say it was super interesting. They agreed to the rights of the book before it even came out. So this is all part of when you said at the top, The Godfather almost never got made. It's like every single part of the way it almost never got made, right? So like in 1965, Puzo was a semi-failed author. You mentioned he'd done 2 books, not super commercially successful. He owed $20K in gambling debts, and you alluded to he knew these stories from the mafia world. And his books previously had stories about these characters. And his agent's just like, man, just write a book about the mafia. He's like, okay, well, I don't really know anything, but I guess I'll do research. Paramount, Robert Evans, they agreed they read the advance of his book. It was like, I think 60 pages. Yeah, they bought the project after 60 pages of what would be 450 pages. And they really got a great deal out of it, which I mentioned in the article. They paid him $12.5K for the book, and they capped his max payout at $80K if they ever made a movie. So it's like one of the greatest deals ever. Godfather ended up making 250 mil plus, which inflation adjusted is probably close to $1 billion.
Yeah, no, it's definitely about $1 billion. So he didn't make any more. Oh, he made $100,000 in the script.
Exactly. They paid him on the script, and he would end up writing Godfather 2 and 3, and then that was just on if they made a movie. He probably also got royalties for sure on the book for years and years and years.
Yeah, but you figure though the book was probably selling for $1, so he probably made 10 cents. So look, that was still a decent amount of money. If he made close to $1 million on Godfather that first year, he was a rich guy in even
and
today's
he could pay off
dollars.
His debts, right? And that was why.
Yeah, he definitely got rid of his debts. So, but that shows you it's really hard. He was 45 years old. He had published 2 books, which many people that's their life dream, is to publish one book.
Yep.
He published 2 great books. They were well received and by critics, but they just didn't sell. It's really hard to make a living as a writer.
Absolutely.
And you kind of have to go for it. Like he did this larger than life story. By the way, have you ever read the book, The Godfather?
I have not read Mario Puzo's book. Embarrassingly, I know I should.
It's a great novel, and most people haven't read it because this is one of those few cases where the movie is at least as good as the book. I mean, the movies are amazing. So, but the book was also very unique and amazing, and it was a huge book, and there's a lot of stories in the book that don't make it into the movie. One of the stories, he goes on for like 60 or 70 pages about this one minor character in the book, and I forget which one now, but it's all about how she's going through this vagina tightening surgery. And it takes up like 60 pages in the book, this whole experience of this woman. But that, of course, is not in the movie at all. But that's the kind of writer he was. He was like all over the place. And he put together this amazing, epic movie because there were so many stories in it.
Didn't Moby Dick have like 100 pages just about Will capturing equipment? It sounds like that type of random tangent.
Yeah. The difference is a little bit is that Puzo was very, very story driven. So he was telling a story. Whereas Herman Melville, I do suspect probably was not as good a writer as the educational system claims, because that was boring as hell, that book. Because of stuff like that. Yeah. Like, who wants to hear all about whale equipment? I mean, even
like 100 pages on spears.
Yeah. I mean, Hemingway sort of did it right with Old Man and the Sea, which literally minimalism. Like he kept all that. He wrote about that stuff, but kept it to a minimum, the way the old man would see it, as opposed to the way a reader might need to have a manual about it. But yeah, The Godfather was an excellent novel. I highly recommend it. And Evans was smart. Like Robert Evans, there's been documentaries about him too. He was a
Yep.
particularly interesting movie executive. Like, what was his story?
Well, he was definitely larger than life. He came out of nowhere. So this is the excerpt from his obituary. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2019. It starts from the New York Times. He was a women's pants salesman who went to Hollywood and then met an actress at the Beverly's Hotel pool. And this actress ended up getting him into the film industry. And he ended up at Paramount. And you mentioned Puzo's book, but also in that year, 69 or 70, the year after, Evans had bought another book called Love Story. It was there was like the two of the number two best-selling books ever in that decade was The Godfather and Love Story. And he made a movie based on Love Story. So he had one massive success with a book. So he's like, I'm going to try to do it again with The Godfather. So kind of fell into this job as a producer. I'll add one note from the 1980s before we continue the Godfather story, but he was involved in a crazy scandal. He did another movie with Coppola. Let me see, I think it was called The Content Club, but the TLDR about it was he co-produced it with somebody. The other individual he co-produced it with was kidnapped and murdered. And the other co-producer was kidnapped and murdered because he was supposed to get somebody else in on the movie deal, and that ended up not happening. And then Robert Evans spent almost a decade, I think, trying to prove his innocence, that he wasn't involved for this murder for hire. So absolutely wild.
Do you think he was involved?
He was cleared.
But do you think he was involved?
I can't pass judgment on it. I don't know enough about the case, but the court of law says he was not. So I'm just going to go with that.
All right, good enough. But then, so he's the one though, like he was basically the producer, and he has to put together the director, the actors, and so on.
Yep.
And I also read initially that they didn't want Coppola at first. They wanted like Elias Kazan or some of these older directors. Like, what happened there?
So everything we're saying just ties back to the exact thing you said. Like every step of the way is something that made it not happen, right? So we just talked about industries dying, a conglomerate buying it that want to kill the creativity, and then Puzo doesn't even want to read the book that's the source material. So like the next thing is, as you mentioned, they didn't even want Coppola to direct it. He was the 12th option. Well, technically, 12 people rejected the Godfather film. And Coppola was one of the 12, but you mentioned one of the directors that they approached. They approached 11 other ones. And some of the reasons that they rejected it was actually, you already touched on. A lot of them were turned away by that vagina surgery story. They're like, what is this?
Really?
Like, we didn't like, yeah, they were just like, they're like, this is a trashy book. That was their perception. And the Sicilian mobster theme had already flopped recently. So Kirk Douglas did a movie in, I believe it's 1968, called The Brotherhood. It was about the Sicilian mafia. Complete and utter flop. And in the previous, I think 10, 15 years, there's a couple other gangster movies. One was called Pay or Die. Another one was called Hoodlum Empire. But none of these movies did well. And what was interesting and helped the film in the long run with Coppola was he actually was Italian-American. The other 11 directors that Evans and Paramount approached were not Italian-American. So as they're trying to, as the Paramount was trying to make The Godfather happen, there's a ton of pushback by Italian-American organizations. They thought the portrayal of Italian-Americans was showing them, hey, they're all mobsters. They're all part of the mafia, right? So one of the Italian-American organizations actually had the word mafia taken out of the script. So it's not even mentioned in The Godfather. And same with the Sicilian term, La Cosa Nostra, which most of us are probably know as the basically Italian version of the mafia. So both those terms are not in the movie because of how hard of a topic the Italian mob was in the early 70s. Obviously now, mob films have, over the past decades, since The Godfather, have been everywhere. But just to circle back to your original question, yeah, they did not think Coppola was good enough to do the movie. And then they ended up relenting because of how much pushback they got from the Italian-American community. And they just figured, very cynically, to mind you, that, hey, maybe we can push this project out the door if we can say, by the way, we have an Italian-American director.
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main. That's Mizzen and Main. it really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and or cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get 2 memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply. So it's interesting, and I didn't know this. Apparently, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, I guess Steven Spielberg, like some of these other famous who became famous directors.
All homies. All homies.
Yeah, this is really a fascinating thing because, well, describe what they did. They started their own little studio because they were getting frustrated with the big studio scene.
Yep, exactly. They so this group came up together. We talked about how corporations were taking over the Hollywood studios, and we actually hear a lot about now the corporatizing of Hollywood. A similar thing was happening in the late '60s, and a lot of these directors, we'll just rattle them off right now because this is such an amazing group. They're collectively known as the movie brats. So you had Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, Coppola, George Lucas, and Brian De Palma were all kind of part of this group. They wanted to be away from the Hollywood system. They wanted to tell their own type of stories. And Lucas and Coppola specifically joined together to form an independent studio called American Zoetrope. And Zoetrope was waiting. They're financially quite strapped. And Lucas, who was a bit younger than Coppola, but they were kind of creative partners and partners together, he was kind of pushing him. He's like, man, we need something. Like, we need a hit, man. And Godfather ended up being the first hit for kind of this group of directors. So this is what happened. Godfather hits. It gives American Zoetrope, the production company for Lucas and Coppola, a cash cushion, right? Because Godfather's a huge hit. The year later, American Graffiti comes out, which is about George Lucas's childhood growing up, I believe, in California. And that was another big hit. I think it made $100 million on like a $7 million budget.
Wow.
And then obviously what happens with American Graffiti? George Lucas now gets to write his own check. And I've written a previous story about how Lucas was able to take the American Graffiti victory and turn that into Star Wars, and not only turn it into Star Wars, negotiate one of the greatest deals ever, where he said, I'll do Star Wars, but I get to keep all the sequel and merchandising rights. So that's something that we could talk about, I'm sure, another time. And then I'll rattle off a couple more. Martin Scorsese did Mean Streets in 1973. You mentioned the Conversation with Coppola in 74, the same year he did Godfather. Brian De Palma did Carrie in 1976, the Stephen King horror. And then Spielberg did a little movie called Jaws in 1975. And then Scorsese, last one I'll mention is Taxi Driver in 76.
Man,
and the Star Wars 77.
So all of those movies you could see now, and they don't appear dated. Like, they're such great,
incredible films.
Movies. And so did they all, I didn't know this, did they all make money on these films? Like, for instance, did George Lucas make money on The Godfather?
I don't know the setup with American Zoetrope, but as a shared production company. So that production company was just him and Coppola primarily. They were the two co-owners of that production company. So I'm sure that they split the goodies on that, and then American Graffiti afterwards.
Yeah, American Graffiti was great, and like you mentioned, he used that to. I think he also made one other movie, THX 1138, which is kind
Oh,
of.
that was before. That was before American
Oh, okay.
Graffiti. Yeah, you're right.
And then Star Wars, of course. And then okay, so Coppola. So everybody thought mafia movies would be a flop. That also surprises me because now it's a common trope. Like, let's take a secretive organization where there's family succession issues and there's violence, and you're also going up against the government, but your hero is a bad guy. This is like a common trope now, and I'm surprised it would be not looked on as a formula for success back then.
Well, it was the Sopranosization of this type of content, right? Like Tony Soprano being the anti-hero, and then you had Walter White with Breaking Bad, and then you had all the villains, quote unquote, in The Wire. But in The Wire, you realize that everyone's the villain, and the whole system is the villain, right? So I think between The Godfather and probably the mid 90s, the idea of like the anti-hero was not really there. And then previous to that, also the idea of the anti-hero was not super prominent. And I do want to emphasize that the fact that a lot of these previous gangster movies, Italian gangster movies, were done by non-Italians, I think that really did play into it. They were done, not surprisingly, a lot of the director and acting talent was Jewish around that time. And that was mentioned in a lot of these documentaries around the Godfather.
Well, and also you mentioned, and this is probably related, but like the studio wanted someone like Robert Redford, who's the least Italian-looking person on the planet, to play the role of Michael Corleone. How is that even possible?
Well, this goes back. Now we're moving on to the next point. This is now the fifth reason why this film almost never happened. Right?
Actually, I skipped the fifth one. We'll get back to the fifth one, but I'm just amazed by this is the sixth one.
Okay, we'll talk. You're the casting. That is amazing. The interesting thing about Robert Redford was he was obviously a bigger star. Let me see what year Sundance came out. I think Sundance came out Sundance, Butch. I think that was 69. Yeah, so 69, Butch Cassidy Sundance Kid comes out. Obviously, massive hit. Robert Redford's a huge star. The book, and I didn't know this, so you may remember, but in Mario Puzo's The Godfather, Michael Corleone actually looks like Robert Redford. He is a tall, handsome individual. Al Pacino is much shorter and much darker. So the casting actually went against the book. That was the reason part of the reason the studio wanted it. And also, Robert Redford was a star while Al Pacino was a stage actor, but not well known.
So I mean, Al Pacino now in retrospect is so perfect, but I still would have a hard time believing Robert Redford was Italian.
No, exactly, right? And hard time believing he's Italian. And they brought in, God, these the Godfather, the documentaries that I added in the YouTube links for this are so good. But this showed James Caan, who ended up playing Sonny, talked about how they basically brought in hundreds of actors to audition for Michael. The studio just did not want Al Pacino. And Robert Redford was the one they wanted, really, really wanted him. And we'll talk about, I'm sure, shortly in a bit, Marlon Brando, how they also didn't want him. But that was the Al Pacino, Robert Redford story.
So how did Al Pacino convince them?
It was Coppola that convinced them. Coppola, from the documentary, James Caan was saying that Coppola basically shoved it down the studio's throat. He just at every turn, he would bring Al Pacino back to do Michael. Like, no matter who acted, it was just so clear he was positioning for Michael and just basically forced it to happen.
That's so interesting. And yeah, Marlon Brando. So obviously he was great in On the Waterfront. Obviously he was great in The Godfather. The studio didn't want Brando, but it wasn't necessarily because of his acting skill. I guess even then he was considered a problem.
He won On the Waterfront, the Oscar in 1955. And that was, I believe, his mid-30s or early 30s. But he became very toxic as an asset. And the head of Paramount said, we will never have Marlon Brando in a film. His reputation was so bad. And they basically said, okay, to Francis Ford Coppola, if you want Brando, this is what's going to happen. Brando's going to have to put up a $1 million bond in case he ruins the production of the film. And not only that, we're going to pay him scale. We're going to pay him whatever a regular actor from the street will get paid by the guild or whatever the equivalent was. We don't care if he's won an Oscar. He is such a tarnished product to us. These are the terms that we are going to bring to you. So he only got paid scale for The Godfather.
Do you know why he was such a bad? He was considered so toxic.
He was just bad on set. Like even following this, like the stories about him on the Apocalypse Now set are like awful. Like he showed up massively overweight, maybe even obese, like kind of refused to do XYZ, ended up giving an iconic performance, but like he was like known as a very, very difficult individual to work with.
And so okay, so the studio also wanted to film it in like St. Louis. They wanted to do it as low budget as possible. Could you imagine it not being like in a classic New York City setting?
Exactly, right? Exactly. They so it actually goes back to you talking about Mario Puzo's 9 million copies sold. They wanted to strike while the iron was hot. So in their head, they're like, let's just rush something out the door. This IP is so hot right now that we will just take anything. We don't really care what it is, right? That's why they're saying, let's just film in St. Louis. We don't have to worry about paying extra and getting all these different filming licenses in New York City, which is probably more difficult than St. Louis. And then let's set it in 1970s instead of the 40s or post-World War II, which is when the book and the movie now that we know is actually set. That way they don't have to do the costume design and the set design. They're like, let's just get this thing out the door so we can make money. It was like very cynical, right?
And then they were gonna fire Coppola all along until the one scene where
exactly
Michael tips over to the dark side.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's so. I put a spoiler alert in there, but I'm just gonna talk about it. If you haven't seen The Godfather now, and James and I talked about, it's like that's on you at this point.
Yeah, but you know, my wife hadn't seen it until during the pandemic. I forced her to watch it, and of course it was great. We watched all three.
Loved it. Did she love it?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it like 10 or 20 times. It's the most amazing movie.
No, exactly. And well, you mentioned it. It's the scene in basically the middle of the movie when Michael goes to kill the individuals that set up his hit on his father. And after the head of Gulf and Western saw that, they're like, that's when they stopped breathing down Coppola's neck, because up to that point, they hated everything. They're complaining about literally everything. This like the music sucks, the lighting is terrible, like this movie is too dark, and Brando and Pacino aren't cutting it. They had a director waiting in the wings, like literally to replace Coppola on a moment's notice. But after that scene, he had free sailing, and it is to this day, one of the most iconic scenes in film history.
It is, but there were great scenes before then. For instance, when the father is in the hospital, and you know, Al Pacino you see how cool and calm he is when he's outside, and the bad guys sort of drive by, and the other guy, I forget who the other guy was, he kind of like falls to pieces, and that gives you a sense that, oh wait, there's more to Michael Corleone than it seems.
No, exactly. And I would love to chat about like the character arc for Michael, right? Because it's like the story that I didn't realize until recently, because I watched it when I was younger and watched it over the years, but I never really dug into the story. It's like the movie is about American capitalism versus the mob way. And Michael, which is, you can watch it now, it's amazing. In the beginning of the movie, he's wearing a U.S. military suit at the wedding. So it clearly is a juxtaposition between him versus his family, right? It's like so beautifully done. He's like, my allegiance is to the United States of America, whereas everybody else is fit as if they're at a wedding, right? They're all wearing tuxedos and they're all as with the family. But then, as you mentioned, when he's at the hospital after Vito Corleone, his father, gets shot, he starts showing the bravery and asserting himself. And then after the scene where he kills these two individuals at this Italian-American restaurant, that's when he fully converts over. And then by the end of the movie, it's clear who his allegiance is to the family.
Yeah, you know, and it's funny though, because you think of a soldier as someone who is about America. Their job is to defend America. And yet, you know, as you point out, this movie is very much about America and American capitalism. You would think, no, wait, they're criminals. They're outside of capitalism. But even the very first scene, you see Luca Brasi, he's like practicing what he's going to say to, you know, I guess at a wedding, right, you can ask a favor to the Godfather. And so he's practicing what he's going to say to the Godfather. And he's like kind of this brute force guy working for the Godfather. He actually was an ex-wrestler in real life. And he was so nervous. First off, I don't know if you know this, but he botched every scene in that very first scene. He couldn't do that scene where he's asking a favor of Marlon Brando. So they switched the script. So he's just practicing the lines And so that would explain his nervousness later on. So then they're able to use these kind of failed scenes.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
But in this one of the things he's practicing is he's saying over and over again, I believe in America. And it's this idea of America as opposed to just worshiping, an institution or the government or whatever. It's this idea that America is the place where innovation happens, where creativity happens, where frontiers are crossed. And I think when you say The Godfather is about America, it's really about this idea of America, and hopefully America still lives up to those ideals.
100%. There's so many scenes in the movie that do show the like you mentioned, right? It's like showing kind of both ways and what one path might lead you to. And the one that really struck out to me was a lot of people remember this line. Leave the gun, take the cannolis. So when basically a hit is happening out in the fields, but there's an image, amazing framing where in the background is a Statue of Liberty, and in the foreground is where the hit or the dumping of the body happens. So that was like the visual of it is just spectacular.
Yeah, no, it's really and then also I think of like Godfather 2 when Michael moves out to Las Vegas and wants to go there, and then the very slick, non-Italian white guy senator sort of really trashes him for his Italian roots, and yet Michael's more about he wants to be out of crime. He wants to be an entrepreneur in Las Vegas, and it's just he goes up against this racism in order to do it.
There's we could do honestly a whole nother episode about Godfather 2, but there are so many great tidbits like in the making of the second one. Coppola didn't even want to do the second one, but they gave him so much money, he just did it. But the other part I wanted to say regarding American capitalism is, you nailed it. The very first scene, the very first words of the movie are "I believe in America." Right, that's said by the Undertaker.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. I'm sorry, it was said by the funeral guy.
His name was Amerigo Bonacera. Like not even like slightly subtle. It's like his name's Amerigo, and the very first words were "I believe in America." And then he tried the American way to solve the rape of his daughter, where he tried to get the police to do something about it, but the quote unquote American way didn't work. So he's coming to the other Sicilian way.
Yeah, it's amazing how deep these things go in the movie. And then so Francis Ford Coppola finally they accept him as the director. They accept Marlon Brando and Al Pacino as the actors. The script, I guess, like any script, gets written and rewritten a bunch of times, but at least Mario Puzo was involved in it. Were there other things that the studio tried to botch?
That was those were the main one. The budget was the other one that you touched on. They wanted to film in St. Louis, do it in the 70s, set in the 70s instead of post World War II, so it didn't have to redo all the sets and the costumes. But those were the main ones, to be honest. And then once after that scene happened, it was Coppola just finished it. And it premiered on March 14th, 1972, so 50 years ago, at a New York theater. Robert Evans was friends with Henry Kissinger, actually, and took him to the premiere. And Henry Kissinger actually says something which I think you will appreciate from, you were talking about anti-heroes earlier. Kissinger said that this movie was so good because it made you cheer for a character like Vito Corleone, who objectively is a bad person, right?
Yeah.
Like killed hundreds of people, runs a mob family, but because it was framed around family and loyalty, you were much less to think or feel that way in the negative sense.
Well, it's interesting because then you look at this period 30 years later in the OOs, you had The Sopranos, like you said, you had Breaking Bad, you had The Wire.
Yep.
Even Mad Men, Don Draper's not a good guy.
Right.
But he's the
Anti-hero.
hero. Yeah, he's the anti-hero. And that became like a huge thing for a while. I don't even know. It probably still exists now, but it was really the start in television of the anti-hero.
Yep.
And I can't think of a movie before The Godfather. I mean, I guess you could argue Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca is a little bit of an anti-hero,
right,
but he's really turns out to be a hero. There's never at any point you could say Michael Corleone is a hero. Whereas
no, exactly.
Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca does turn out to be a hero. So it's interesting.
In fact, Michael is such a bad dude. It's crazy, right? Like at the end of Godfather 2, it's just him sitting in the chair. It's literally showing that he has completely sold his soul to the devil.
Yeah.
That he killed his own brother to protect the family. He killed his own brother to protect the family. That's how absurd it was.
Yeah, no, he's never good. And Breaking Bad, the guy's never good. Like you sort of feel like he's good because you don't see all the damage the drugs cause,
Right.
but he's never good. Tony Soprano is nonstop a bad guy. He's never a good guy.
But again, you're quote unquote kind of cheering for them, right? Like, because that's just the way it's framed. It's
Totally.
like they're the protagonists. You're following their story.
And so it's interesting, though, in a broader light, it's interesting that something that is so, I mean, The Godfather is obviously not only one of the most critically received movies of all time, it also was, for a short period of time, the biggest box office hit ever. I think Star Wars replaced it or Jaws replaced it. But so it was commercially a huge success. It was critically, arguably it might have been the biggest critical success, the most commercial critical success ever, still to this day.
Oh, like that combo? Yeah, I would. I actually did not know how successful it was commercially until I dug a little bit deeper. But as you mentioned, right, if you did inflation adjusted, like this thing is going to be close to a bill.
Yeah, and so it does suggest though that because it was so hard to make, you have to wonder about a lot of things in life. Like you could say, oh, it was lucky that it was made, but you really need. It wasn't that the luck happened in this sort of haphazard, random way, the way you think luck occurs. Al Pacino became Michael Corleone because he had somehow proven himself to Francis Ford Coppola, and Francis Ford Coppola used his reputation to keep pushing Al Pacino into the role until the studio accepted it. Like there was persistence there. Mario Puzo was giving up as a writer, but he was persistent. He put everything he had into making this novel, and it became one of the greatest novels ever. And then the fact that Francis Ford Coppola had some independent power outside of the studio. He had this American Zoetrope, his own studio, and it was after 12 directors rejected it, so this was like their last shot, really. And this was the director that was going to be acceptable to Italian Americans. He had enough influence to have it shot in New York as opposed to St. Louis. There was all this background. It was like they were all standing on a mountain in order to get lucky.
No, 100%. And one of the books that I bought kind of very eloquently put everything you mentioned, all the obstacles. So the book is called The Annotated Godfather. The author is Jenny M. Jones. Francis Ford Coppola helped kind of put this together, but basically just took the script and had all his notes from the original script. But she said this: one can't help but marvel at how The Godfather ever got made. Every conceivable obstacle stood in its way. A writer didn't want to write it, so that's Puzo. A studio didn't want to produce it, that was Paramount. No film director wanted to touch it. 12 people rejected it. A cast of unknowns outside of Brando, and a community, the Italian Americans, tried to stop it from happening. In fact, the leader of the Italian American community, civics group that tried to stop it, was the son of one of the 5 families of the mob families. So, like, serious obstacles to this getting made.
Yeah. And I guess the lesson in that is A, be persistent, and B, make sure you deserve your luck, in the sense that this wasn't Mario Puzo's first novel, it was his third. Francis Ford Coppola already had some oomph behind him. Al Pacino, I believe, had already done Dog Day Afternoon and some other movies, so at least he was acceptable, even though they didn't want him. And on and on. Like they kind of, and also the fact that it's a very interesting thing that I didn't know, like George Lucas, Brian De Palma,
Scorsese,
Spielberg, all these guys had kind of grew up together as a scene. And you see that in every industry. Like you think about the beat writers in the 50s, Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs, they all went to Columbia together. Or all these artists from each period, they all kind of like were roommates together, and then they blew up as artists, in the 40s or in the 10s or whatever. Like scenes tend to happen in groups, like cultural scenes.
100%.
It's interesting. And tech too. Like look at the PayPal Mafia as a scene.
Exactly.
All those guys sort of grew up together in Silicon Valley, and then now have started the biggest companies on the planet. But they all started off as employees of PayPal or founders of PayPal. So things happen like that in a scene. So if you want to be lucky, kind of find your scene, even if it's virtual or online. And if you love this, if you love what you're doing, you got to be persistent with it. Like obviously Mario Puzo loved writing. Francis Ford Coppola wasn't in the directing business for the money. He loved directing, and so on. And by the way, they didn't like the music at first. The music for The Godfather is amazing.
It's iconic.
I know. I don't even know how you could not like that music. But I'll tell you one last fact about The Godfather that I bet you didn't know, or maybe you did know it, but I don't know. But the scene where Tom's got to go out to Hollywood and make the director an offer he can't refuse in order to get the character who's the Frank Sinatra character in a movie.
Yeah.
And then he leaves a horse's head in the bed, and it's this bloody horse's head. Do you know that was a real horse's head?
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, they didn't like cut off a horse's head. They got it from a dog food company.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Oh,
So
my
that
goodness.
actor who
Well,
played that director, he woke up in bed with a horse's head right there. Like, it's got to be pretty disgusting.
That probably gave why the scene was so well and the scream was so hearty.
Why'd you do this one? Like, what is The Godfather? Obviously, it's one of your favorite movies, but like, why this one?
Yeah, part of the 50th anniversary, I got caught up in the hype. I myself, I don't know if I mentioned last pod, but I have sold a film script.
Oh yeah, you did. Yeah.
I've sold a film script. Like I had Hollywood dreams ages ago. Never came to fruition, but I've always been very enchanted and by Hollywood history. So this is definitely part of it. That was my interest in it, and I was hoping to package it because I mean, if I didn't know some of these things like to the depth that I wrote about, I knew that a lot of my audience wouldn't know about it because I care about this a lot more than they do.
You should do like 10 of these and write like and just staple them together and publish a book like the strange iconic history of Hollywood. So like do Star Wars, do Casablanca, do there's lots of like weird little movies that now completely form our culture.
Yep.
But all of them almost didn't get made.
No, 100%. There are a lot. I mean, even one more recently, I wrote one that got pretty viral. Is about how the first Iron Man almost didn't get made because nobody wanted Robert Downey Jr. to do it. He was not a leading figure at that time. He was, he'd been in prison. He's dealing with drugs and alcohol abuse issues. He had kind of blown up his reputation as an actor, similar to what Brando did to himself. But no, I love that idea. I think I'll do some more, and I'd love to hop back on to retell some of those stories with you.
Oh yeah, anytime. And one other thing, since you've written a script, you'll appreciate this. Mario Puzo had never studied script writing before he wrote The Godfather. He completely wrote that script with Francis Ford Coppola without studying screenwriting at all. Same with Godfather Part 2. And so finally, he figured, you know what? I'm going to be writing scripts for movies. I better look at a book. So he picks up a book about screenwriting. Chapter 1 is a breakdown of The Godfather. So he figured, I already wrote the book, so I don't need to read it anymore.
Well, there you go, right? This goes back to something that I'm sure, theme you've touched on before. A lot of people don't know what's going on, right? Nobody knows anything.
No, and then it goes to show you don't necessarily need to know the standard techniques. Sometimes you throw the book out, and that's how you create something new.
Exactly, and that's exactly what they did.
Yeah.
I'd like to leave with one last tidbit. Is we're talking about groups coming up together, and you'd mentioned Spielberg, Scorsese, Coppola, and Lucas. So this just related to Godfather 2, but Coppola wanted Martin Scorsese directs Godfather 2. So that's a nice tidbit.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, ended up not happening, but that would have been interesting. It probably would have been equally as good. Well, maybe not equally, but Scorsese is no slouch.
Yeah, no, and sometimes it's hard. Like sometimes I have to remind myself who directed what. Like for a long time, I thought Scorsese directed The Conversation, and then I realized no, it was Coppola. Like they have a very similar style.
Yeah, and they're from the kind of edgy New York that like you said, thematically similar.
I think they went to nursery school together. Do you live? I forget. You don't live in New York, right? Have you ever lived in New York?
No, I live in Vancouver.
There's a school in Chinatown, or it was then Little Italy. Now it's Chinatown, where all these guys went to school together. So I think Coppola, Scorsese, maybe Robert De Niro, I forget. But they all kind of grew up together as well, like literally grew up together. So,
well, it's like you said, the group's coming up together.
Yeah, it's true. And all right, well, look, this was The Godfather. Trung Phan, you always have so many interesting things to say. And where's the best place for someone to find your newsletter and get access to all your stuff?
At Trung Phan at Twitter is the best one. I also do the Not Investment Advice podcast. My newsletter is on the Twitter bio. It's with a new company called Work Week. We kind of partnered up together on that. They're just helping me basically they're helping with all the creative stuff so I can get to do more creative stuff like this.
Yeah, and let's do one in a couple of weeks about which companies are not what you expected they would be.
That's a deal. That's a deal, James.
Excellent. All right. Thanks a lot, Trug. See you soon.
All right. Thank you, guys. I got to boogie pick up my kid, but I really appreciate that.